Tonight we will explore the extraordinary life and legacy of Frida Kahlo, one of the most remarkable and deeply human artists in history. As you relax and unwind, you will hear 100 fascinating facts about her paintings, her world, her relationships, and the remarkable courage and creativity that carried her through one of the most extraordinary lives any artist has ever lived. There is no need to stay awake for every detail. Simply listen, rest, and let the story of Frida Kahlo gently guide you towards sleep. Frida Kahlo was born on the 6th of July 1907 in Coyoacán, a quiet residential neighborhood on the southern edge of Mexico City that was, at the time, still a largely separate town with its own distinct character and community life. She spent almost her entire life within a few kilometers of the house where she was born, a vivid blue building known as the Casa Azul, the Blue House, that her father had built before her birth, and that would eventually become both her primary home and, after her death, the museum that now holds the largest collection of her personal belongings and a significant portion of her paintings. The neighborhood of Coyoacán, with its cobblestone streets, colonial architecture, and particular quality of afternoon light, is present in her work in ways that are not always immediately obvious, but that give many of her paintings their specific sense of place and rootedness. Frida's father, Guillermo Kahlo, was a German-born photographer of Hungarian Jewish descent, who had emigrated to Mexico in 1891 and built a successful career documenting the country's architectural heritage under commissions from the government of President Porfirio Diaz. He was an epileptic, a condition that Frida would later cite as a bond between them, and he was, by all accounts, a man of considerable sensitivity and intellectual curiosity who encouraged his daughter's education and her developing interest in art from an early age. His photography, with its careful attention to light, composition, and the documentation of Mexican cultural identity, has been seen by some scholars as a formative influence on the visual sensibility Frida developed as a painter, an eye trained from childhood on images that took the physical world seriously as a subject worthy of careful and sustained attention. Frida contracted polio at the age of 6, an illness that left her right leg permanently thinner and shorter than her left, causing a slight limp that she would carry for the rest of her life, and that made her the subject of childhood teasing that she addressed with characteristic defiance by wearing thick socks to disguise the difference in her legs. The experience of being marked out physically from an early age, of inhabiting a body that did not conform to what was expected of it, shaped her relationship with her own physical self in ways that would become central to her painting decades later. She later said that the polio had given her an understanding of physical vulnerability and bodily difference that she could not have arrived at any other way, and the attention she brought to the depiction of her own body in her paintings, unflinching, precise, neither sentimentalized nor disgusted, reflects an intimacy with physical reality that began in those early years. In 1922, at the age of 15, Frida was admitted to the National Preparatory School in Mexico City, one of the most prestigious educational institutions in the country, where she was among the first group of female students admitted following the school's recent decision to begin accepting women. The school was an intellectually vibrant environment where students engaged seriously with politics, philosophy, literature, and the arts, and Frida became part of a group of particularly spirited and intellectually ambitious young people who called themselves the Cachuchas, named after the caps they wore, and who were known for their pranks, their passionate political debates, and their wide reading. It was during her years at the preparatory school that she first encountered Diego Rivera, who was painting a mural in the school's auditorium, and developed the intense and somewhat mischievous fascination with him that would eventually, years later, become one of the most significant relationships of her life. On the 17th of September 1925, when Frida was 18 years old, the bus she was traveling on after school collided with a streetcar in one of the most severe accidents in Mexico City that year, an event that would define the physical reality of the rest of her life. The collision caused the bus to splinter, and Frida was impaled by a steel handrail that entered her hip and exited through her pelvis. While her spinal column was broken in 3 places, her collarbone and several ribs were fractured. Her right leg was broken in 11 places, and her right foot was crushed. She survived the accident against the expectations of several of the doctors who treated her in the immediate aftermath, and the recovery process that followed, involving months of immobilization in a full-body cast, was the period during which she began painting seriously. Propped up in bed, with a specially constructed easel and a mirror mounted above her so that she could see her own face. The mirror that Frida's mother had installed above her bed during her recovery from the accident became the tool through which she began the sustained engagement with her own image that would produce some of the most remarkable self-portraits in the history of art. She painted herself not because she was narcissistic, she was characteristically direct about her reasons, saying simply that she painted herself because she was the subject she knew best and the one most available to her during the long months of confinement, but because the mirror gave her unmediated access to a face and a body that had just been through something extraordinary, and that carried in its expression and its physical reality a record of that experience that she felt compelled to set down. She produced approximately 55 self-portraits over the course of her career, more than a third of her total output, and they remain the works for which she is most immediately recognized. Frida's relationship with Diego Rivera, which began in earnest in 1928 when she approached him for his assessment of her early paintings, was the central emotional relationship of her adult life, turbulent, deeply loving, mutually damaging, and ultimately irreplaceable to both of them. Rivera was already one of the most celebrated artists in Mexico when they met, a large, physically imposing man, 21 years her senior, whose murals were transforming public spaces across the country, and whose personal life was as complicated and as publicly discussed as his artistic one. He recognized the quality of her work immediately, encouraged her to continue painting, and within a year they were married, a union that her mother described with some accuracy as a marriage between an elephant and a dove. They would divorce in 1939 and remarry in 1940, maintaining a relationship that neither of them was ever able to entirely resolve or entirely abandon. Frida underwent approximately 35 surgical operations over the course of her life, the majority of them related to the injuries sustained in the 1925 bus accident and the long-term physical consequences that those injuries produced over the following decades. The surgeries addressed a range of conditions, including her damaged spinal column, her repeatedly fractured right leg, and the chronic pain that resulted from the complex interaction of injuries that had never fully healed. She spent significant portions of her adult life in hospitals, in plaster corsets, and in recovery from procedures that frequently failed to produce the relief they had promised. And the experience of inhabiting a body in a state of perpetual medical crisis informed her painting in ways that went far beyond the direct depictions of surgery and physical suffering that appear in several of her most well-known works. Pain was not simply a subject for her, it was the medium within which her entire creative life was conducted. The Casa Azul, the blue house in Coyoacán where Frida was born, lived most of her life, and died, is now the Museo Frida Kahlo and holds the most significant collection of her personal belongings anywhere in the world. The museum preserves the house largely as it was during her lifetime, with her painting materials, her extensive collection of pre-Columbian artifacts, her elaborate traditional costumes, her medicine bottles and medical corsets, and the four-poster bed with the mirror above it, all still in the rooms where she used them. Visitors moved through the spaces where she painted, cooked, entertained, and spent her long periods of confinement with a quality of proximity to a specific human life that very few artist museums anywhere in the world are able to provide. The blue walls of the exterior, which Frida and Diego chose together, have become one of the most recognized colors in Mexican cultural life. Frida's distinctive personal style, the elaborate Tehuana costumes, the flowers and ribbons woven into her hair, the heavy pre-Columbian jewelry. The dramatic makeup was not simply a personal aesthetic preference, but a carefully considered political and cultural statement about Mexican identity and the value of indigenous traditions, at a time when European influences dominated the cultural life of the Mexican elite. The Tehuana dress, originating from the Isthmus of Tehuantepec in the state of Oaxaca, was associated with a matriarchal society in which women held significant economic and social power, and Frida's adoption of it as her daily dress was a conscious identification with those values and with a vision of Mexican womanhood that was rooted in indigenous rather than European traditions. Diego Rivera encouraged her adoption of the style, but the conviction with which she wore it and the way she transformed it into a personal language that was unmistakably her own went far beyond anything that could be attributed to his influence alone. Frida was deeply involved in the political life of Mexico throughout her adult years, and her commitment to communism was genuine, sustained, and practically expressed rather than simply a fashionable intellectual position adopted for social reasons. She joined the Mexican Communist Party in 1927, left it for a period during the 1930s, and rejoined it in 1948, maintaining her political convictions consistently across the shifting landscape of Mexican and international left-wing politics over more than 2 decades. Her home became a gathering place for artists, intellectuals, and political figures from across the ideological spectrum, and she was directly involved in one of the most dramatic episodes of 20th century political history, when she and Diego Rivera provided refuge in the Casa Azul for the exiled Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky, who lived there from 1937 to 1939. Leon Trotsky's stay at the Casa Azul brought an extraordinary episode of international political history directly into the domestic world of Coyoacán, and the experience of hosting one of the most wanted men in the world left a mark on Frida's life that went beyond the political significance of the gesture. Trotsky had been expelled from the Soviet Union by Stalin and was living in exile, moving between countries under constant threat of assassination, when Diego Rivera used his considerable political connections to secure him asylum in Mexico. Frida and Trotsky developed a close and apparently flirtatious relationship during his time at the Casa Azul, and she gave him one of her self-portraits as a gift, a painting that he kept in his possession until his assassination in Mexico City in 1940. The episode illustrated the degree to which the Casa Azul functioned not simply as a private home, but as a space where the major political and cultural currents of the 20th century converged in unusually direct and personal ways. Frida's paintings were small by the standards of the art world. She eventually entered most of them no larger than a sheet of paper, many of them significantly smaller, and the intimacy of their scale was inseparable from the intimacy of their content and the conditions under which they were made. She worked primarily on masonite, metal, and canvas, often using a small easel that could be set up on her bed or in whatever space was available to her during periods of confinement. And the physical constraints of her working situation shaped the scale and format of her work in ways that she eventually came to regard not as limitations, but as defining characteristics. The small scale demanded that the viewer come close, that the painting be held or approached rather than viewed from a distance. and this physical intimacy between the work and its viewer is part of what gives her paintings their quality of direct and unmediated personal address. Frida's first solo exhibition in Mexico took place in 1953, organized by the photographer and gallerist Lola Alvarez Bravo at her gallery in Mexico City, and it became one of the most celebrated and most dramatically memorable exhibition openings in the history of Mexican art. Frida was seriously ill at the time, and her doctors had forbidden her from leaving her bed, but she refused to miss the opening of the first major presentation of her work in her own country, and arranged to be transported to the gallery by ambulance, arriving on a stretcher that was carried into the space and placed in the center of the room so that she could receive her guests lying down. She spent the evening surrounded by friends, fellow artists, and admirers, talking, laughing, and singing Mexican songs in a performance of defiant vitality that those who witnessed it described as one of the most moving experiences of their lives. The relationship between Frida's painting and the tradition of Mexican retablo painting, small devotional images painted on tin that depicted miraculous interventions and were left as offerings in churches, was direct, acknowledged, and it shaped both the format and the visual language of many of her most significant work. Retablos were typically small, painted on metal, and combined a depicted scene with a written text explaining the miraculous event being commemorated, and Frida adopted all of these elements: the small scale, the metal support, the combination of image and text in works that replace the religious miracle with the personal crisis, and the divine intervention with the bare fact of survival. The tradition gave her a visual framework for depicting suffering and endurance that was rooted in Mexican popular culture rather than European fine art, and her use of it was both a formal choice and a statement about where she located her own artistic identity and allegiances. Frida experienced 3 miscarriages during her marriage to Diego Rivera, none of which her damaged body was able to carry to term, and the grief of those losses is recorded in several of her most emotionally powerful paintings with a directness that the art world of her time found almost unbearably confronting. The painting My Birth, completed in 1932 following her second miscarriage, shows the moment of birth with a clinical and unflinching explicitness that has no real precedent in the history of Western art: a dead or unconscious mother, a fully formed infant emerging from her body, and above the bed, a painting of the Virgin of Sorrows pierced with 7 swords. The work was so confronting that Diego Rivera later said he knew of no woman who would have had the courage to paint it, and several of the American collectors who might otherwise have purchased it refused on the grounds that they could not imagine hanging it in their homes. Frida's relationship with her own cultural identity was complex and carefully considered, reflecting the mixed heritage of a woman who was the daughter of a German immigrant father and a mother of Spanish and indigenous Mexican descent, growing up in a country that was actively engaged in the project of defining what Mexican national identity meant in the aftermath of the revolution. She consistently emphasized her Mexican identity over her European heritage, presenting herself publicly as a child of the revolution and aligning herself visually and politically with the indigenous traditions of Mexico rather than with the European culture that her father represented. She sometimes claimed, inaccurately, to have been born in 1910 rather than 1907, the year the Mexican Revolution began, as a way of symbolically identifying her own birth with the birth of revolutionary Mexico, a small and characteristic act of self-mythologizing that reveals how seriously she took the political dimensions of personal identity. The painting, The Two Fridas, completed in 1939 in the immediate aftermath of her divorce from Diego Rivera, is one of the largest and most formally ambitious works she ever produced, and one that represents a significant departure from the small, intimate format that characterized most of her output. The painting shows two versions of Frida seated side by side, one dressed in a white European gown, her heart exposed and cut open, bleeding onto her lap, and the other dressed in a Tijuana costume, her heart whole and connected by a vein to a small portrait of Diego that she holds in her hand. The European Frida's heart is disconnected and bleeding. The Mexican Frida's heart is intact. The painting has been read as an expression of the division within her own identity, as a record of the emotional devastation of the divorce, and as a statement about the relationship between her two cultural inheritances, all of which it appears to be simultaneously. Frida's international reputation was established significantly earlier than her reputation in Mexico, a fact that reflects both the particular character of the European and American art worlds of the 1930s and 40s, and the specific circumstances through which her work first came to widespread attention outside her home country. The French Surrealist leader André Breton encountered her work during a visit to Mexico in 1938 and was immediately enthusiastic, describing her painting as a ribbon around a bomb and organizing an exhibition of her work in Paris the following year. Frida was ambivalent about the Surrealist label. She consistently maintained that she did not paint dreams or fantasies, but her own reality, and that what Breton called surrealism was simply the most direct way she knew of depicting the world as she actually experienced it. The distinction mattered to her, and she resisted the categorization with a consistency that reflected a genuine difference in artistic philosophy rather than simple contrariness. Frida's extensive collection of pre-Columbian artifacts, which she assembled over many years and displayed throughout the Casa Azul, reflected a deep and scholarly engagement with the ancient cultures of Mexico that went well beyond decorative interest or fashionable primitivism. She collected ceramic figures, stone sculptures, and textile fragments from a range of pre-Hispanic cultures, including the Aztec, Maya, Teotihuacan, and Zapotec traditions, and she integrated these objects into her daily living environment in ways that treated them as living presences rather than museum pieces. The collection is now displayed in the Casa Azul Museum and provides an important context for understanding the visual sources of her painting, the bold outlines, the frontal presentation of figures, and the combination of symbolic and naturalistic elements that characterize her work all have antecedents in the pre-Columbian traditions she studied and surrounded herself with throughout her adult life. Frida's health deteriorated significantly in the final years of her life, and the last decade before her death in 1954 was marked by a series of medical crises, increasing dependence on painkillers and alcohol, and periods of profound depression that made sustained work increasingly difficult to maintain. Her right leg, which had never fully recovered from the injuries of the 1925 accident, was amputated below the knee in 1953, following a gangrene infection that could not be treated by other means, a loss that devastated her psychologically, in ways that the physical pain of the surgery itself could not fully account for. She wrote in her diary after the amputation that she had wanted to drown her sorrow, but the damned booze would not let her, a characteristically dark and self-aware observation from a woman who had spent her entire adult life finding ways to keep living in circumstances that gave her every reason not to. Frida Kahlo died on the 13th of July 1954 in the Casa Azul in Coyoacán at the age of 47, 1 week after attending her last public appearance, a political demonstration against the American-backed coup in Guatemala that she joined despite being seriously ill and having been advised by her doctors to remain at home. The official cause of death was recorded as pulmonary embolism, though some people close to her believe that she may have taken her own life, a question that has never been definitively resolved. Her last diary entry, written in the days before her death, reads that she hoped the departure would be joyful and hoped never to return a sentence that has been interpreted as a farewell, as an expression of exhaustion, and as the kind of ambiguous statement that a woman who had spent her life resisting simple interpretations would naturally leave behind. Frida's painting, What the Water Gave Me, completed in 1938, is one of the most complex and richly symbolic works she ever produced, depicting the surface of a bath seen from above, with a collection of objects, figures, and scenes floating in the water around her own feet. The painting draws on the tradition of the retableau and the visual language of dreams to create a compressed autobiography in which the major episodes, relationships, and preoccupations of her life appear simultaneously, rather than in sequence: her parents, her injuries, the accident, her loves, her political beliefs, and the natural world of Mexico, all present together in the same shallow space of water. She described it as a painting of what she thought about when she lay in the bath, which is both a straightforward description of its subject and a characteristic understatement of the emotional and symbolic complexity it contains. The gallery owner and art dealer Julien Levy, who gave Frida her first solo exhibition in New York in 1938, played a significant role in establishing her reputation in the United States at a moment when the American art market was beginning to develop serious interest in Latin American modernism. The exhibition, held at the Julien Levy Gallery in Manhattan, attracted considerable attention from both the art world and the popular press, partly because of the quality and originality of the work, and partly because of Frida's own striking personal presence. Her elaborate costumes, her jewelry, and her direct and entertaining manner made her a memorable figure in the social world of New York, in ways that helped draw audiences to the gallery. Several works sold during the exhibition, including purchases by the actor Edward G. Robinson, and the critical response was sufficiently strong to establish her as a significant figure in the international art world, rather than simply a curiosity associated with Diego Rivera's more famous name. Frida's use of text within her paintings, inscriptions, labels, written dedications, and explanatory banners of the kind used in retableau painting gave her work a quality of direct address that distinguished it from the conventions of European fine art and connected it to a broader tradition of Mexican visual culture, in which image and word worked together rather than the image being expected to communicate entirely on its own. Several of her paintings include written dedications to specific people, turning the work into something between a painting and a letter, a private communication made in a public medium. Others include labels identifying the figures or objects depicted in a manner borrowed directly from the retableau tradition, that give the paintings a quality of documentary specificity alongside their symbolic complexity. The combination of image and text creates a layered experience of meaning in which the written words do not simply explain the image, but add a further dimension that neither element could achieve alone. Frida's friendship with the photographer Nicolas Mouret, whom she met in Mexico in 1931, and with whom she maintained a close and at times romantic relationship over the following decade, produced some of the most celebrated photographic portraits ever made of her, and an extensive correspondence that provides a valuable record of her inner life during some of the most turbulent years of her marriage to Diego. Mouret was a Hungarian-born commercial photographer working in New York, whose technical skill and personal understanding of his subject combined to produce images of Frida that captured both her physical presence and the quality of emotional intelligence and self-awareness that animated it. The color photographs he made of her in 1939, showing her in her Tijuana costume against a simple background, are among the most reproduced images of her ever taken, and have become almost as iconic as her self-portraits in shaping the global visual understanding of who she was. Frida's painting Self-Portrait with Thorn Necklace and Hummingbird, completed in 1940, is one of the most immediately recognizable images in 20th century art, and one that demonstrates her ability to load a deceptively simple composition with multiple layers of personal, cultural, and symbolic meaning. The painting shows her facing the viewer directly, wearing a necklace of thorns that press into her neck and draw drops of blood, with a dead hummingbird hanging from the necklace, a black cat behind her left shoulder, and a monkey behind her right. The thorns reference the crown of thorns and the idea of suffering as a form of spiritual experience. The hummingbird, in Mexican tradition, brings luck in love. The cat and the monkey were actual animals she kept at the Casa Azul. The painting was made in the year following her divorce from Diego, and the combination of elements creates a portrait of a woman simultaneously wounded, defiant, and rooted in the specific world she inhabited. The Surrealist movement's claim on Frida's work, which began with André Breton's enthusiastic endorsement in 1938 and has persisted in various forms in the critical literature ever since, has been one of the most contested aspects of her critical reception, and one that she herself consistently and emphatically rejected. She argued that her paintings were not expressions of the unconscious or explorations of dream imagery in the manner of Dalí or Magritte, but direct depictions of her own lived experience, that the symbolic and seemingly fantastical elements of her work were not departures from reality, but the most accurate way she knew of representing the reality she actually inhabited. The distinction between a reality that happens to look surreal and a deliberately constructed surrealist image was important to her both artistically and personally, and the insistence with which she maintained it against the pressure of Breton's authoritative categorization reflects the same stubbornness and self-knowledge that characterized her approach to every other aspect of her life. Frida's painting The Broken Column, completed in 1944 following a spinal surgery that had failed to provide the relief it had promised, is one of the most direct and most harrowing depictions of physical pain produced by any artist in the history of Western art. The painting shows her standing in a barren, cracked landscape, her body split open to reveal a crumbling ionic column in place of her spine, her skin pierced by nails across her entire body, her face streaked with tears, held together by a medical corset that is the only thing preventing her from collapsing entirely. She is naked except for the corset and a white cloth draped around her hips, and her expression combines pain with a quality of absolute composure. She is not asking for pity, she is simply showing what is there. The painting is clinical in its honesty and devastating in its effect, and it remains one of the most powerful images of bodily suffering in the history of art. Frida's relationship with her mother, Matilde Calderón y González, was difficult and at times deeply strained, a contrast to the close and mutually devoted relationship she maintained with her father throughout his life. She described her mother as cruel, calculating, and unable to provide the warmth and emotional availability that she needed, and the two women maintained a relationship of dutiful but not particularly affectionate contact rather than the deep bond that Frida shared with Guillermo. Her mother's death in 1941 affected her more than she had expected, and the complexity of grieving a relationship that had never been fully resolved or satisfying is one of the themes that runs through her diary entries from that period. The painting My Grandparents, My Parents and I, completed in 1936, places the family in a formal genealogical diagram that acknowledges the full complexity of her mixed heritage without sentimentalizing any part of it. Frida maintained a significant and carefully curated collection of traditional Mexican dress throughout her adult life, and the wardrobe she assembled over several decades is now recognized as a significant cultural artifact in its own right, preserved and studied as an expression of her aesthetic, political, and personal identity. The collection includes hundreds of garments, huipiles, skirts, blouses, shawls, and rebozos from various regions of Mexico, many of them customized by Frida herself, with embroidery, paint, and small decorative additions that made each piece uniquely her own. When the wardrobe was opened for the first time after decades of storage at the Casa Azul in 2004, the discovery of the clothes exactly as she had left them, some still carrying the marks of her body, some altered in her characteristic way, created an extraordinary sense of physical proximity to a person who had been dead for 50 years. Frida's painting Without Hope, completed in 1945 during a period of serious illness in which she had lost so much weight that her doctors were force-feeding her, depicts a skeletal figure lying in bed, being force-fed an enormous stream of food, skulls, fish, and a live chicken by a figure standing over her. The painting is a direct response to the specific medical situation she was living through, translated into the visual language of symbolic exaggeration that she used to transform personal experience into something that communicated beyond its specific biographical origins. The landscape behind the figure is the cracked, arid terrain that appears in several of her paintings as a metaphor for emotional and physical desolation, and the skull among the objects being forced into the figure's mouth introduces the proximity of death into a scene that is simultaneously grotesque and darkly comic in the manner that characterized her most personal work. The diary that Frida kept during the last decade of her life, now held in the Museo Frida Kahlo in the Casa Azul, is one of the most intimate and visually extraordinary personal documents left behind by any artist of the 20th century. The diary combines written entries with drawings, watercolors, collaged elements, and free associative visual sequences that have the quality of an extended private artwork rather than a conventional record of daily events. The writing moves between political reflection, expressions of love and grief, philosophical observation, and direct accounts of her physical condition, sometimes within the same page, creating a document of remarkable emotional range and visual richness. It was first published in facsimile in 1995 and has since been studied extensively as both a biographical source and an artwork in its own right. Frida's painting The Wounded Deer, completed in 1946 following a spinal operation that had once again failed to provide lasting relief, shows a young deer with Frida's own face, its body pierced by 9 arrows, standing in a forest clearing with a broken branch in the foreground and a stormy sky visible through the trees behind it. The image draws on the tradition of Saint Sebastian, the Christian martyr depicted in countless Renaissance paintings as a figure whose body is pierced by arrows but who remains alive through divine grace, and transposes that iconography into a specifically personal and Mexican context. The deer looks out at the viewer with an expression of calm acceptance rather than anguish, and the word karma fate is inscribed in the lower left corner of the painting, reflecting the philosophical acceptance of suffering that Frida was working toward during this period, without ever arriving at a state of complete equanimity about the hand she had been dealt. Frida's engagement with the art of other cultures extended beyond the pre-Columbian traditions of Mexico to include a deep admiration for European old masters, particularly the Flemish painters of the 15th and 16th centuries, whose meticulous attention to detail, jewel-like color, and combination of religious symbolism with precise naturalistic observation resonated with her own approach to painting. She admired the work of Jan van Eyck and Hans Holbein in particular, and the influence of Flemish portraiture is visible in the precise rendering of surface textures, skin, fabric, jewelry, hair that characterizes her self-portraits and her depictions of objects. The combination of Flemish technical precision with Mexican symbolic content and pre-Columbian visual references creates a visual language in her work that is genuinely hybrid, rooted in multiple traditions simultaneously, without being fully assimilable into any of them. Frida's painting My Nurse and I, completed in 1937, depicts her as an adult woman with the body of a child being nursed by a figure wearing a pre-Columbian mask, whose breast shows the lactiferous ducts beneath the skin in a detail borrowed from a medical illustration. The painting explores the relationship between nourishment and cultural identity, the idea that what we are fed in infancy shapes us in ways that go deeper than conscious choice and connects Frida's own sense of herself, as nourished by the indigenous traditions of Mexico, to the most fundamental and pre-conscious level of human experience. The masked nurse's face removes individual identity and replaces it with cultural and historical identity, suggesting that what Frida received from Mexico was not personal but collective, a heritage rather than a relationship. The international art market's relationship with Frida's work has undergone a transformation over the past several decades that has taken her paintings from relative obscurity to the category of the most financially valuable works produced by any Latin American artist in history. Her painting Dos Desnudos en el Bosque, Two Nudes in a Forest, sold at auction in 2016 for $8 million, setting a record for her work at that time, and subsequent sales have continued to push the market value of her paintings to levels that reflect their status as among the most culturally significant works of the 20th century. The financial trajectory of her work mirrors in some ways the posthumous trajectory of Van Gogh's, a painter who sold almost nothing during her lifetime, whose work is now among the most sought after in the world, though. The timescale of her rise to canonical status was considerably compressed compared to his. Frida's self-portrait as a Tehuana, also known as Diego on My Mind, completed in 1943, shows her face framed by an elaborate headdress of flowers and lace, with a small portrait of Diego Rivera painted on her forehead in the position where a bindi or a third eye might be located. The image literalizes the idea of carrying someone in your thoughts, of having a person so present in your mental life that they become visible on the surface of your face with a directness that is characteristic of her. Approach to depicting interior experience through exterior image. The headdress connects her to the Tehuana identity she had adopted as her own, and the combination of the elaborate cultural framing with the intimate and vulnerable gesture of wearing Diego's face on her forehead creates one of the most quietly devastating images of love and its complications that she ever produced. Frida's painting, Tree of Hope, Stand Fast, completed in 1946 following her spinal surgery at the Hospital for Special Surgery in New York, shows two versions of herself in the same landscape, one lying on a hospital gurney with the surgical wounds on her back exposed to the light, and one sitting upright in a Tehuana dress holding a red corset and a banner bearing the painting's title. The two figures represent the vulnerable body subjected to medical intervention and the will that refuses to be defeated by it, and the relationship between them. The sitting figure, watching over the lying one, with an expression of fierce protectiveness, captures something essential about the internal dynamic that allowed Frida to survive what her body endured over the course of her life. The painting was made as a gift for Eduardo Villaseñor, a friend who had supported her during her time in New York, and it carries the quality of a personal statement made in the form of a gift, an act of generosity that is also an act of self-affirmation. Frida's relationship with animals was deep and practical rather than sentimental, and the Casa Azul, during the years of her and Diego's residence, there was home to an extraordinary menagerie that included spider monkeys, a fawn, eagles, parrots, a turkey, hairless Mexican dogs known as Exoloitzcuintles, and at various times a number of other creatures that she treated as companions and incorporated into her paintings as symbolic presences. The spider monkeys that appear in several of her self-portraits were real animals that she kept and cared for, and they function in the painting simultaneously as actual presences from her daily life and as symbols of sexuality, of the children she was unable to have, of a kind of untamed natural vitality that existed alongside and in contrast to the medical and physical constraints of her existence. The animals in her paintings are never simply decorative, they are always doing something specific within the symbolic economy of the image. Frida's painting Self-Portrait with Cropped Hair, completed in 1940, shows her seated in a man's suit holding a pair of scissors and surrounded by strands of her cut hair, with a line of music and lyrics at the top of the canvas from a popular Mexican song that translates roughly as, "Look, if I loved you, it was for your hair. Now that you are without hair, I no longer love you." The painting was made immediately after her divorce from Diego, and the cutting of her hair, which Diego had loved, and which she had always worn in elaborate traditional styles, was a direct and deliberately visible act of severance from the identity she had partially constructed around his desires and preferences. The man's suit she wears in the painting was another element of the same gesture, a rejection of the Tijuana femininity that Diego had encouraged in favor of something harder, more autonomous, and more deliberately distanced from the role of being loved. Frida's painting Roots, completed in 1943, shows her lying in a barren Mexican landscape with a large leafy vine growing from an opening in her chest and spreading across the dry ground around her, its roots pushing into the cracked earth as if drawing nourishment from the soil. The image connects her body directly to the land of Mexico in a way that literalizes the idea of belonging to a place, of being rooted in it physically, rather than simply culturally or emotionally, and it represents one of her clearest visual statements about the relationship between personal identity and geographical and cultural origin that runs through so much of her work. The landscape is simultaneously arid and generative, and the vine growing from her body suggests that the creative and vital forces she drew on were inseparable from the specific place and tradition that had produced her. Frida's international celebrity, which developed rapidly in the decades following her death and has continued to accelerate through the late 20th and early 21st centuries, has created a cultural phenomenon of a scale and character that goes well beyond the normal boundaries of art world recognition and into something closer to global popular iconography. Her face, the unibrow, the flowers in her hair, the direct and level gaze is now among the most recognized visual signatures in the world, reproduced on a range of commercial products, adapted in countless artistic tributes and parodies, and adopted as a symbol of female creativity, resilience, and political resistance by communities and individuals across an extraordinary range of cultural contexts. The question of what this level of celebrity does to the actual work, whether it helps or hinders a genuine encounter with the paintings themselves, is one that scholars and critics have been grappling with for several decades, without arriving at a settled answer. Frida's painting, The Two Fridas, which now hangs in the Museo de Arte Moderno in Mexico City, it was purchased by the Mexican government in 1943 for 1,000 pesos, a price that reflected the modest commercial value attached to her work during her lifetime, and that stands in almost incomprehensible contrast to the tens of millions of dollars that her paintings command at auction today. The purchase was facilitated by the writer and politician José Vasconcelos, who had been one of the driving forces behind the Mexican muralist movement, and who recognized the significance of the work despite the limited critical attention it had received at the time. The painting had been shown at the International Surrealism Exhibition in Mexico City in 1940, where it attracted considerable interest but no immediate sale, and its acquisition by a public institution rather than a private collector meant that it remained visible and accessible in Mexico in a way that several of her other major works, which passed into private collections abroad, did not. Frida's complicated relationship with her own body extended beyond the physical pain of her injuries and surgeries to encompass a deep and lifelong engagement with the question of how a body that had been so damaged and so repeatedly subjected to medical intervention could also be a source of creativity, sensuality, and vital experience. She dressed and adorned herself with an elaborateness and care that reflected a genuine pleasure in the aesthetic possibilities of her own physical presence, and she maintained romantic and sexual relationships throughout her adult life with both men and women that expressed an appetite for physical and emotional intimacy that her medical situation did nothing to diminish. The tension between the body as a site of suffering and the body as a site of pleasure and creativity runs through her work in ways that give it an emotional complexity that purely biographical readings tend to flatten into a simpler narrative of heroic endurance. The influence of Diego Rivera on Frida's development as a painter has been a subject of considerable scholarly debate, with some researchers emphasizing the degree to which his encouragement, his artistic philosophy, and his political convictions shaped her work, and others arguing that her artistic vision was so distinctly her own that his influence, while real, was less formative than the biographical relationship between them might suggest. What is clear is that Rivera recognized the quality of her work from the beginning and consistently maintained that she was a better painter than he was, a judgment that may have been generous, but that reflected a genuine appreciation for the originality and emotional power of what she was doing. His murals, with their emphasis on Mexican history, indigenous culture, and political narrative, provided a broad ideological framework within which her much more personal and intimate work developed, but the specific visual language she created was entirely her own and owed nothing to his style or his technique. Frida's painting Self-Portrait on the Border Between Mexico and the United States, completed in 1932 during the period she spent in Detroit, while Diego worked on his commission for the Detroit Institute of Arts, reflects her deep discomfort with American industrial culture and her longing for the Mexico she had left behind. The painting shows her standing on a pedestal at the border between two worlds. On one side, the ancient temples, flowers, and natural forms of Mexico. On the other, the smokestacks, factories, and electric signs of industrial America, holding a Mexican flag in one hand and a cigarette in the other, her expression combining defiance with a quality of deliberate composure. She found Detroit alienating and the culture of industrial capitalism antithetical to everything she valued, and the painting translates that feeling into a visual argument about the relationship between two fundamentally different ways of organizing human life and the human relationship with the natural world. Frida's time in the United States during the early 1930s spent primarily in San Francisco, Detroit, and New York, while Diego fulfilled various mural commissions, gave her an exposure to the American art world and American culture that she found simultaneously stimulating and deeply uncongenial. She made connections with artists, collectors, and cultural figures across the country, learned to speak English with considerable fluency, and navigated the social world of American cultural life with the same directness and personal authority she brought to every environment she entered. But she remained throughout these years profoundly oriented toward Mexico, writing to friends that she missed the colors, the food, the light, and the particular quality of daily life in Coyoacán with an intensity that made her American years feel, despite their richness and their importance for her career, like a prolonged interruption of the life she actually wanted to be living. The medical corsets that Frida wore throughout much of her adult life, plaster, leather, and steel constructions designed to support her damaged spine, became objects of artistic expression in her hands, decorated with paint, mirrors, political symbols, and personal imagery that transformed medical devices into extensions of the visual language she was developing in her paintings. Several of the corsets are preserved in the Casa Azul Museum and have been exhibited internationally as works in their own right, and they provide a remarkably direct record of the relationship between her art making and the physical conditions of her life. The corset as both the constraint that limited her movement and the surface on which she continued to work when other surfaces were unavailable. The decorated corsets are among the most intimate and most revealing objects associated with her name, combining the clinical reality of her medical situation with the creative vitality that she brought to every aspect of her existence. Frida's painting Henry Ford Hospital, completed in 1932 following her miscarriage in Detroit, is one of the most explicit and emotionally unguarded works she ever produced, and one that marked a significant development in her willingness to use the conventions of the retableau tradition to depict experiences that fine art had almost never addressed directly. The painting shows her lying in a hospital bed in a pool of blood, holding 6 objects connected to her by red threads: a fetus, a female pelvis, a snail, a pink torso, an orchid, and a medical apparatus, each of which represents a different aspect of the physical and emotional experience of the miscarriage. The Detroit skyline, visible through the window in the background, locates the experience precisely in time and place, and the combination of clinical specificity and deeply personal symbolic content creates a work that was entirely without precedent in the art of its time, and that remains one of the most honest depictions of pregnancy loss ever made. Frida's friendships with other women were a consistent source of emotional sustenance throughout her life, and she maintained close and deeply felt relationships with a number of remarkable individuals whose own lives and work intersected with hers in ways that enriched and complicated the more famous story of her marriage to Diego. The photographer Tina Modotti, the artist Maria Izquierdo, the gallerist Lola Alvarez Bravo, and the politician and writer Elena Vasquez Gomez were among the women who formed part of her social and creative world, and her relationships with them provided a quality of mutual understanding and intellectual companionship that the more dramatic and consuming relationship with Diego could not always supply. Her capacity for friendship, for sustained, loyal, and genuinely reciprocal engagement with people she cared about is one of the aspects of her character that the biographical emphasis on her suffering and her marriage has tended to obscure. The painting Self-Portrait with Monkey, of which Frida produced 4 versions between 1938 and 1945, is one of the clearest examples of the way she used the animals of the Casa Azul simultaneously as presences from her actual daily life and as symbolic figures within the carefully constructed world of her paintings. The spider monkey in the various versions of the painting is always positioned close to her body, its arm around her shoulder, its face near hers in a posture of physical intimacy that gives the animal a quality of companionship and protection that she associated with the children she was unable to have. The monkey's dark eyes and the direct gaze of the human face beside it create compositions of remarkable stillness and psychological depth, and the repetition of the subject across 4 separate paintings suggests how central the image was to her ongoing exploration of her own identity and its relationship to the world she inhabited. Frida's engagement with the political events of her time extended to direct participation in ways that went beyond the theoretical commitment that many artists of her generation maintained toward left-wing causes without translating into practical action. She was present at political meetings and demonstrations throughout her adult life, used her home as a space for political organizing and discussion, and maintained her public political commitments even during periods of serious illness, when the physical effort of participation was considerable. Her attendance at the demonstration against the American-backed coup in Guatemala in July 1954, 1 week before her death, when she was carried in her wheelchair through the streets of Mexico City despite being seriously ill, was her last public act and a final demonstration of the consistency between her stated convictions and her actual behavior that had characterized her political life from the beginning. The exhibition of Frida's work, organized by André Breton in Paris in 1939, held at the Renoué-Cole Gallery under the title Mexique, was a significant moment in the international recognition of her work, but also a deeply frustrating experience for Frida herself, who found the logistical incompetence with which Breton organized the show and the condescending exoticism with which French cultural life received her work almost as alienating as her experience of the United States had been. Several of her paintings were held up in customs for weeks because of paperwork problems that Breton had failed to resolve, and the exhibition had to be supplemented with works by other Mexican artists and pre-Columbian objects to fill the space. She wrote to Nicolas Murray from Paris that she would rather sit on the floor of a market in Mexico and sell tortillas than have anything to do with those European artistic bitches, a characteristically direct expression of her preference for her own cultural context over the prestige of international recognition on terms that were not her own. Frida's painting Self-Portrait with the portrait of Dr. Faril, completed in 1951 following a series of operations performed by her orthopedic surgeon Juan Faril, shows her in her wheelchair beside a large portrait of the doctor, holding a palette made of hearts and a brush dripping with blood rather than paint. The painting is a tribute to Faril, who had genuinely helped her more than most of the surgeons who had treated her over the decades, and it is also a reflection on the relationship between medical care and artistic creation, on the idea that painting was for her a form of healing that ran parallel to and sometimes in spite of the medical interventions her body required. The palette of hearts and the brush of blood literalize the idea of painting as a physical and emotional expenditure, of giving something of the body's own substance in the act of making an image. The broader cultural context of post-revolutionary Mexico within which Frida's work was produced was one in which the relationship between art, national identity, and political transformation was understood in unusually direct and practically consequential terms. The Mexican muralist movement, led by Diego Rivera, José Clemente Orozco, and David Alfaro Siqueiros, had established a model of public art as a vehicle for political education and national self-definition that gave visual art a social function and a public significance that was very different from the gallery-based model of European modernism. Frida operated within this context while producing work that was almost entirely private in its scale and its subject matter, and the tension between the public ambitions of the muralist tradition and the intensely personal vision of her own painting is one of the defining tensions of her artistic identity, and one that she navigated with characteristic independence throughout her career. Frida's painting The Dream, also known as The Bed, completed in 1940, shows her sleeping in her four-poster bed with a skeleton figure lying on top of the canopy above her, wreathed in plants and explosive devices whose fuses are unlit, as if death is present but not yet triggered. The skeleton is a Judas figure, one of the papier-mâché skeleton figures traditionally burned during Holy Week celebrations in Mexico, and its presence above her sleeping body connects the painting to a specifically Mexican tradition of living alongside and celebrating death rather than treating it as something to be feared or denied. The plants growing through and around the skeleton suggest the relationship between death and regeneration that runs through Mexican cultural traditions associated with the Day of the Dead, and the unlit fuses introduce a note of suspension of a moment held just before its inevitable conclusion that gives the painting its particular quality of suspended time. Frida's technique as a painter, which she developed largely through self-directed practice rather than formal training, was technically accomplished in ways that are not always immediately apparent to viewers, more engaged with the emotional content of her work than with its material execution. She prepared her surfaces carefully, applied paint in thin, controlled layers that built up slowly to the precise effects she was after, and used fine brushes that allowed a level of detail in the rendering of surface textures, skin, fabric, hair, jewelry, the petals of flowers that required both technical skill and considerable patience. The small scale of most of her works meant that this level of detail was achieved in a confined space that demanded sustained precision over extended periods, and the physical difficulties of working in a body that was frequently in pain added a further dimension of effort to a process that would have been demanding under any circumstances. Frida's painting Self-Portrait with Loose Hair, completed in 1947, is one of the quietest and most formally restrained of all her self-portraits, showing her face against a plain background with her hair loose around her shoulders rather than arranged in the elaborate traditional styles she usually wore in both her daily life and her painting. The loosened hair, which appears in several of the works made during and after her divorce from Diego, carries the same significance it carried in Self-Portrait with Cropped Hair, a departure from the elaborate self-presentation associated with her relationship with Diego and a movement towards something simpler, more private, and more directly expressive of her own sense of herself when the performance of identity that her public life required was temporarily set aside. The painting has a quality of unusual stillness and vulnerability that distinguishes it from the more symbolically complex works of the same period. The role that Frida's work has played in the development of Chicana feminist art and thought in the United States from the 1970s onward represents one of the most significant and most politically charged dimensions of her posthumous legacy, and one that has shaped the terms in which her work has been discussed and understood across a wide range of cultural and academic contexts. Artists and writers, including Yolanda Lopez, Gloria Anzaldúa, and Cheria Moraga, drew on her image and her work as a resource for thinking about the relationship between gender, ethnicity, cultural identity, and artistic practice, in ways that gave her legacy a political and theoretical dimension that went well beyond the art historical. The adoption of her image as a symbol of Chicana identity and feminist resistance transformed her from a celebrated Mexican painter into a global cultural icon whose significance extended far beyond the specific circumstances of her life and work. Frida's painting Thinking About Death, completed in 1943, shows her face against a background of leaves and thorns with a small oval opening in her forehead through which a skull and crossbones is visible, as if death is literally present within her thoughts in the way that Diego was literally present on her forehead in Diego on My Mind. The painting reflects the sustained engagement with mortality that characterized her thinking throughout her adult life, and that was given particular urgency by the physical reality of a body that had been close to death multiple times, and that lived in chronic proximity to pain and medical crisis. Her relationship with death was neither morbid nor resigned, it was matter-of-fact, informed by the Mexican cultural tradition of treating death as a presence in daily life rather than a terminus to be avoided in thought and conversation. And it gave her work a quality of unflinching honesty about the full range of human experience that more sheltered lives rarely produce. Frida's painting The Broken Column has been reproduced so widely and encountered so frequently in so many different contexts, on posters, in textbooks, in political demonstrations, in tattoos and murals across the world, that it now functions simultaneously as a specific artwork with a precise biographical and historical context, and as a general symbol of physical suffering endured with dignity that has become detached from its origins and taken on a life of its own in the broader visual culture. This process of symbolic generalization, through which a highly specific personal image becomes a universally legible sign, is one of the more remarkable aspects of her posthumous cultural life and reflects a quality in her most powerful works, their ability to communicate across vast differences of cultural context and personal experience that she could not have anticipated, and that the particular circumstances of their creation could not entirely explain. Frida's painting Without Hope and her diary entries from the same period, the mid-1940s, reveal a woman whose physical and psychological condition was deteriorating in ways that she was fully aware of and that she continued to document with the same unflinching honesty she had always brought to her own experience, even as the effort of documentation became increasingly difficult. The diary entries from this period alternate between expressions of political conviction, love for Diego, philosophical reflection, and direct accounts of physical pain and despair that make for some of the most emotionally raw reading in the literature associated with any major artist of the 20th century. She wrote with equal directness about her body's failures and her spirit's refusals, and the combination of the two, the physical reality and the response to it, gives the late diary its particular quality of testimony, of a record made with full awareness of its own significance and its own cost. Frida's painting Self-Portrait with Braid, completed in 1941, shows her with her hair arranged in an elaborate traditional style, woven with ribbons and wool threads in the manner of the women of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, her neck adorned with pre-Columbian jade beads, her expression carrying the quality of composed authority that characterizes her most formally resolved self-portrait. The painting was made during a period of relative stability following her remarriage to Diego in 1940, and the elaborate hair arrangement and traditional jewelry reflect a return to the carefully constructed public identity she had temporarily abandoned during the years of their divorce. The composition is one of her most formally beautiful, the geometry of the braided hair, the color of the beads against her skin, and the plain background, combining to create an image of remarkable visual coherence and quiet emotional power that rewards sustained looking in ways that her more symbolically complex works do not always make immediately available. The Museo Frida Kahlo in Coyoacán receives hundreds of thousands of visitors each year from every part of the world, making it one of the most visited artist museums in Latin America and one of the most significant cultural destinations in Mexico City. The experience of visiting the museum is unlike most artist museum experiences, because the Casa Azul preserves not simply the works, but the entire physical environment of a life. The kitchen with its painted tile walls, the garden where she kept her animals, the studio where she worked, the bedroom where she spent so many of her confined hours in a way that creates an unusually immediate sense of proximity to a specific person in a specific place. The blue walls that give the house its name glow with particular intensity in the afternoon light of the Mexican sun, and the garden, with its pre-Columbian sculptures and flowering plants, has a quality of contained and purposeful beauty that reflects the aesthetic intelligence its owner brought to every aspect of her existence. Frida's work entered the collection of the Louvre in Paris in 1939, making her the first Mexican artist and one of the first Latin American artists to have a work acquired by the institution, a fact that was reported with considerable pride in the Mexican press, and that represented a significant moment in the international legitimation of her painting. The work acquired was a self-portrait, and its entry into the Louvre collection came at a moment when the international art world was just beginning to develop the institutional frameworks and critical vocabulary needed to engage seriously with art produced outside the Western, European and North American traditions that had dominated its attention throughout the modern period. The acquisition was less a recognition of a fully understood achievement than an early acknowledgement that something important was happening in her work, that the existing critical frameworks had not yet found the language to fully describe. Frida's painting, The Love Embrace of the Universe, the Earth, Diego, Me and Señor Xolotl, completed in 1949, is one of the most cosmologically ambitious works she ever produced, showing a series of concentric embracing figures, a cosmic figure holding the Earth holding Frida, Frida holding Diego as an infant with a third eye on his forehead, and a hairless dog curled at her feet, arranged in a hierarchy that moves from the universal to the utterly personal. The painting represents her most explicit visual statement about the relationship between love, creativity, and the natural and cosmic forces within which individual human relationships are embedded. And it places Diego, the man who had caused her the most joy and the most pain of anyone in her life, at the center of a universe arranged around the act of holding and being held. The third eye on Diego's forehead identifies him as a visionary, and Frida's position as the one who holds him connects her to the series of containing and nourishing figures, the nurse, the earth, the cosmic mother that appear throughout her work. The critical reassessment of Frida's work that began in the 1970s and accelerated through the 1980s transformed her from a figure known primarily as Diego Rivera's wife and a colorful personality in the Soundsed, the story of Mexican modernism, into a canonical artist whose work was understood to be of major significance in its own right and on its own terms. The reassessment was driven by a combination of feminist art criticism, the growing international interest in non-Western modernisms, and the publication of Hayden Herrera's comprehensive biography in 1983, which brought her life and work to an international audience of a scale and diversity that no previous account had reached. Herrera's biography remained for many years the primary source through which English-speaking readers encountered Frida's story, and its influence on the popular understanding of her life and work has been enormous and in some respects difficult to entirely separate from the work itself. Frida's painting My Family, left unfinished at her death and now held in the Museo Frida Kahlo, was intended as a comprehensive genealogical portrait in the tradition of the earlier My Grandparents, My Parents and I, but expanded to include a wider range of family members and rendered in a more formally ambitious compositional scheme than the earlier work. The unfinished state of the painting, some figures fully realized, others barely sketched in, the background only partially developed, gives it a quality of suspended incompletion that is both frustrating and moving, a record of an intention that was not able to reach its conclusion. The painting is one of several works she left unfinished at the time of her death, and the group of incomplete canvases she left behind has been studied by scholars as evidence of the degree to which her physical deterioration in her final years was affecting her ability to work at the pace and level of completion she had maintained throughout her career. Frida's relationship with the photographer Imogen Cunningham, whom she met during her time in San Francisco in 1930 and who photographed her during that visit, was one of a number of connections she made with significant figures in the American art world during her years in the United States that contributed to the gradual development of her international reputation. Cunningham's photographs of Frida from this period show a young woman of striking physical presence who had not yet developed the full elaborateness of the public identity she would later construct, and they provide a valuable record of her appearance and manner at a moment before her work and her image had become fully formed. The photographs have been exhibited and published extensively in the decades since they were taken and have contributed to the visual archive through which Frida's life is understood and imagined by people who encounter her story for the first time. The question of how Frida's work should be categorized as surrealism, as magic realism, as Mexican modernism, as feminist art, as autobiography in paint, has been debated by art historians and critics since her work first attracted serious international attention, and the persistence of the debate reflects a genuine quality of her painting that resists easy assimilation into any single critical framework. Her work draws on so many different traditions: European fine art, Mexican popular culture, pre-Columbian visual language, medical illustration, retableau painting, Flemish portraiture, and combines them in ways so specific to her own experience and vision that the categories available to describe it always feel slightly too large or too small to fit. This resistance to categorization is not a limitation of the critical vocabulary available to describe her work. It is a reflection of the genuine originality of what she produced, and it is one of the reasons her painting continues to generate new responses and new interpretive approaches more than 70 years after her death. Frida's painting, Flower of Life, completed in 1943, is one of the few works in her output that is explicitly erotic in its imagery, showing a large flower whose forms suggest both male and female reproductive anatomy, rendered with the same precise and unsentimental attention to physical detail that characterizes her depictions of the human body throughout her work. The painting reflects the directness with which she approached questions of sexuality and the body in her private life and in her thinking about her own identity, and it demonstrates that the frankness about physical experience that characterized her self-portraits extended to a broader engagement with the erotic dimensions of natural life that she found in the flowers, fruits, and organic forms of the Mexican landscape around her. The work is less frequently reproduced and discussed than her self-portraits, but it represents an important dimension of her visual world that the more familiar images do not fully convey. Frida's late painting Without Hope, her diary entries from the final years of her life, and the accounts of those who were close to her during this period together, create a picture of a woman whose physical deterioration was increasingly difficult to manage, but whose intellectual and emotional engagement with the world around her remained intense and undiminished almost until the end. She continued to receive friends, to discuss politics and art, to write in her diary, and to paint when her condition allowed. And the image of her final years as a period of simple decline and despair is contradicted by the evidence of a life that maintained its characteristic combination of suffering and vitality, of pain and pleasure, of darkness, and an insistence on finding whatever color and meaning the available circumstances could provide. The last painting she completed before her death was a still life of watermelons, painted 8 days before she died, inscribed with the words, "Viva la vida, long live life." The still life of watermelons that Frida painted in the final days of her life, with its inscription "Viva la vida," has become one of the most discussed and most reproduced of all her works, precisely because of the circumstances of its creation and the apparent defiance of its message in the face of what she must have known was approaching. The painting is simple by her standards, a group of cut and whole watermelons filling the canvas with the deep red and green of their flesh and skin, rendered with the precise attention to surface and color that she brought to all her work, and the inscription, painted in large letters across the cut face of the largest melon, transforms a still life into a statement. Whether the statement was one of genuine affirmation, of willed determination, or of the particular Mexican cultural relationship with death that treats it as a part of life rather than its negation, it has resonated with viewers across the world in ways that make it one of the most emotionally affecting final works left behind by any artist in the history of art. The biography of Frida Kahlo, written by Hayden Herrera and published in 1983, was researched over a period of more than a decade and drew on interviews with dozens of people who had known Frida personally, including Diego Rivera, various friends and colleagues, and members of the medical teams who had treated her over the years. The book was the first comprehensive English-language account of her life and work, and it transformed the international understanding of both, bringing to a wide audience a story that had previously been accessible mainly to Spanish speakers and to those with specialist knowledge of Mexican art history. Its publication coincided with a broader cultural moment in which feminist art criticism was actively working to recover and revalue the work of women artists who had been overlooked or marginalized by the predominantly male-centered narrative of art history, and the timing gave Herrera's biography an immediate relevance and reception that a similar book published a decade earlier might not have achieved. The film Frida, directed by Julie Taymor and released in 2002, with Salma Hayek in the title role, brought Frida's story to a global popular audience of a scale that no previous account of her life had reached, and played a significant role in accelerating the process by which she became a figure of global popular iconography, rather than simply a celebrated artist. The film was produced by Hayek, who had spent years working to bring the project to the screen against considerable industry resistance, and it won 2 Academy Awards and was nominated for several others, achieving a level of mainstream recognition that translated directly into increased visitor numbers at the Museo Frida Kahlo and increased public interest in her paintings internationally. The relationship between the film's portrait of Frida and the historical reality of her life and work is complex. The film simplifies and dramatizes in the ways that films necessarily do, but its role in making her accessible to audiences who might never have encountered her through the art world alone is undeniable. Frida's painting Self-Portrait, dedicated to Leon Trotsky, also known as Between the Curtains, completed in 1937 and given to Trotsky as a birthday gift during his residence at the Casa Azul, shows her standing between 2 curtains holding a bunch of flowers and a piece of paper with a dedication inscribed on it, dressed in a traditional Mexican costume and looking directly at the viewer with an expression of composed formality. The painting is one of her most classically composed and least symbolically complex self-portraits, and its relative simplicity has been read as a reflection of the specific relational context in which it was made a gift for a particular person on a particular occasion, intended to communicate a quality of personal regard rather than to explore the deeper psychological and symbolic territories of her more private work. Trotsky kept the painting until his assassination in 1940, after which it passed through several collections before being acquired by the National Museum of Women in the Arts in Washington, where it now hangs. The pre-Columbian artifacts that Frida and Diego collected together over several decades form one of the most significant private collections of ancient Mexican art ever assembled, and the portion of the collection that remains at the Casa Azul provides an essential context for understanding the visual sources and cultural commitments that informed her painting throughout her career. Diego was the more systematic and scholarly collector of the two, but Frida's engagement with the objects was equally deep and considerably more personal. She lived among them, arranged them throughout the rooms of the house, and treated them as presences that contributed to the specific atmosphere and identity of the space she inhabited. The collection includes ceramic figures, stone masks, and textile fragments from a range of pre-Hispanic cultures. And its integration into the domestic environment of the Casa Azul reflects the conviction, shared by both Frida and Diego, that these objects belong to the living culture of Mexico rather than to the dead past of a museum display case. Frida's painting The Wounded Table, completed in 1940s and exhibited at the International Surrealism Exhibition in Mexico City in 1940, was one of her largest works and one of the most ambitious compositional undertakings of her career, but it was lost after being sent to an exhibition in Warsaw following the Second World War and has not been seen since. Its disappearance means that knowledge of the work depends entirely on photographs taken before it left Mexico, which show a large table with bleeding legs surrounded by a group of figures including a Judas figure, a pre-Columbian idol, a skeleton, and several children, with Frida herself seated at the center. The loss of the painting, one of only a handful of large-scale works she completed, represents a significant gap in the surviving record of her output, and a reminder that the completeness of any artist's legacy depends on the accidents of survival and loss as much as on the intentions and achievements of the artist herself. Frida's friendships with other artists provided a network of creative and emotional support that supplemented and at times sustained her through the periods when her relationship with Diego was at its most difficult and her physical condition was at its most demanding. The sculptor Isamu Noguchi, with whom she had a romantic relationship in the 1930s, the painter Georgia O'Keeffe, whom she met during her time in New York, and the photographer Manuel Alvarez Bravo, who documented her life and work over many years, were among the artists whose relationships with her combined personal affection with a quality of mutual professional respect that she found genuinely nourishing. These relationships remind us that her life, for all its drama and difficulty, was also richly populated with people who recognized her quality and whose own work and thinking she engaged with seriously and with genuine reciprocal interest. Frida's painting, Roots, Self-Portrait as a Tehuana, and the various self-portraits in which she presents herself against backgrounds of Mexican flora and fauna, together constitute a sustained visual argument about the relationship between personal identity and natural environment that gives her work a dimension of ecological thinking that has become increasingly relevant to how her painting is understood and discussed in the 21st century. The idea that a person is shaped by and inseparable from the specific landscape, climate, and natural world they inhabit, that identity is rooted in place, in the most literal sense, runs through her work in ways that connect it to contemporary conversations about the relationship between human beings and the natural, the world that she could not have anticipated, but that her paintings address with a directness and visual intelligence that makes them feel surprisingly current. The global reach of Frida's image in the 21st century extends to contexts and communities that have no direct connection to Mexico, to the art world, or to the specific historical and cultural circumstances that produced her work, and the universality of her appeal across these diverse contexts raises genuine questions about what it is in her image and her story that communicates so directly across such vast differences of experience and background. Part of the answer lies in the particular combination of qualities her story offers: the physical suffering endured without self-pity. The creative work continued in the face of obstacles that would have defeated most people: the refusal to conform to the expectations of gender, nationality, or artistic convention qualities that speak to something in human experience that is genuinely universal, even when the specific circumstances that gave rise to them are entirely particular. Her image has become a vessel for meanings that go beyond her biography, and the process by which that has happened is one of the more remarkable cultural phenomena of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Frida's final diary entry, written in the days before her death in July 1954, ends with the words that have been quoted more widely than almost anything else. She ever wrote a sentence that carries within it the full complexity of a life lived, in the conditions she had lived it in, and the particular quality of awareness that those conditions had produced. She wrote that she hoped the departure would be joyful and that she hoped never to return, and the sentence has been read as a farewell, as an expression of relief, as a statement of exhaustion, and as the last act of the same honest and undeflected self-observation that had produced 47 years of painting, writing, loving, suffering, and insisting on the value of all of it. It is the ending that a life like hers deserved: clear, direct, without self-pity, and entirely her own. Somewhere tonight, the blue walls of the Casa Azul are quiet in the dark, and the garden is still, and the light that falls on Coyoacan is the same light that fell there when she was alive, and the night is deep and full of rest.